Okay, so here's your chance to learn from the experts. Let me light up a little bit up here. Now you can see the experts. um, so we do have, I think, 2 roving microphones. So if you have a question, just flag them down, and then we can all hear your question and have a discussion.
Perhaps just a comment. Sometimes we choose the worst video in terms of risk and things like that. Looking at this video, I have a lot of respect for these men and women who work, I mean, very agile, some of them. It's amazing the way and the speed at which they work and the way. I just want to respect that and acknowledge that.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I think it's easy to think, oh, it's an informal economy. These must be mostly unskilled workers. But if you watch them do this dismantling, they're incredibly skilled at what they do. Now, they may not have the perspective, of course, that everyone in this room brings in terms of, well, gosh, you know, that might make you sick eventually. But in terms of getting it done, they do a phenomenal job with the most basic of tools in many cases. Yeah, please, Gloria.
Microphone.
I have some questions in a group of engineers about the dismantling of CTV televisions,
Sure.
monitors. Yeah, and these workshops and the houses of the recyclers, as we found interesting discussions about which is the gas or the vacuum that is when you broke the monitor and look for the Gaussian coil, suddenly the people hear something that comes from inside. And was a lot of discussions about this as a gas, as a pollutant gas, as a vacuum gas. And for us was super interesting because in different places, the people talk about the toxicity or not. Some people said, oh, this is radioactive. You know, the different kind of knowledge or imaginations about this process. And I saw that any part appear, something like that. And then I look for an internet, and I saw maybe in the older, in older monitors, there are some pollutant things, you know. Maybe it's an interesting thing for the people and for you. What is the...
Yeah, I can respond to that, but Olivia, if you have Sure, so I think that there's 2 things that really resonate with me with that comment. Number one, I think that oftentimes when you hear a discussion in the engineering community, and I don't think this is true, and that's rarely true in other communities, in the engineering community, when we talk about technology development for low and middle income countries, we often talk about this lack of information, like, oh, these users just don't know, right? That's often not the case. People often have lots of information. And I want to second echo this thing of saying people are making a decision for a reason, right? So one of the things that resonates with me is that the people have some model, some paradigm for what they believe is going on, and that has varying levels of connection to what is actually going on, right? And that's true everywhere. That's not just true in e-waste, it's true for everybody. I would say that for vacuum, we can talk about the technical nature of it. It's likely that the sound they're hearing when they break it is that you're breaking a vacuum tube and that the gas is actually rushing in to the space rather than out. It's not like this was filled with a gas that's escaping. It's more that you're imploding sort of the vacuum tube by breaking it structurally. But there are pollutants inside it. So for old ones, especially CRTs, often had lead on the inside. That's the lead exposure that Rick was talking about. So when you break this glass, there is like a dust that's on the inside, and there are other chemicals in it. I wouldn't say that those are necessarily in a gaseous form, but often are being spread into your environment through that. So I think that's the answer to your question. I think the bigger question is that I would love to talk with everybody about is this idea of, well, how are you making this decision for how to take this apart, right? So the people were having this discussion with themselves about, well, we think this might be toxic. Well, I'm not really sure. What are the different, sort of hypotheses that I have about that? Is it worth it to break it this way in order to get this thing? If it is toxic, if it's not toxic. So that's showing something about the value that they're making some decision based on their value of it, right? So they're trying to weigh this cost benefit of how much money, how long does it take to do it this way? I could take it off without breaking the tube, but that would take me a long time. is it worth this risk of toxic? Is it really toxic? I don't know. So that balance, trying to understand that decision better, I think will allow us to think about whether an intervention would work, right? And I want to also be clear that I'm not sure that a technology is necessarily the right intervention. You know, as engineers, we often say that. I'm not claiming that. But I'm saying when we think about it, I think for us, it's really important in order to make good engineering decisions that we understand that conversation. So having conversations with you about, okay, well, what was the conversation they were having about this? What was the way things that they were valuing in terms of trying to make this balance about how to do it? And what was their choice set in terms of their alternatives? So I think another question is, what other alternatives do they have to getting that? We haven't even talked about like the really dangerous thing in TVs, and they take apart a lot of TVs and microwaves, which is sort of shocking to me because there's like really high energy capacitors in there, and you can like really hurt yourself taking apart old TVs. Like they hold a lot of charge, and so like if you read instructions on how to do this, they're always like, oh, you have to cut this particular cable wearing rubber gloves with rubber handled things and like ground it immediately so you don't shock yourself, and you know. For microwaves especially, but also for CRTs. And that was sometimes happening. People talked about it, some people talked about it, other people didn't, as a risk. And you know, so again, what is that paradigm? How are people making the decision and how to dismantle it? So I think it's a very good question.
Pablo, yeah.
Hi, this question is for GC and for Jolid, I think. You mentioned like the money, all the money of this goes in dismantling, you think that, and taking the pieces apart. And I remember that in January we talked a lot about repairing. It's something that we saw a lot in Chile in repairing parts. And so what is your perspective? You still don't think this is a good idea to kind of getting into that? It's kind of like, we saw a lot of people, you show the three big ones, you know, TVs, refrigerators, and washer machines. People take like sometimes washer machines from the trash and they fix it and then they sell it and they can use it for, I don't know, 10 more years. So what is your perspective on that? And also, I don't know if like the people from Ghana or Thailand can mention that there was no repairing at all in those countries. And don't you think it can be like a good business, maybe trying to get up some of these materials, try to repair them and sell it again as a...
Let me just answer the last part of your question first. So there were repair activities happening in Thailand and in Ghana. They weren't as prominent, I would say, as in Chile and not as high volume, but there were people who would say, yes, I'm going to take this and repair it. Now, why it's not more common in those countries with comparison to Chile, I think there's some cultural factors and maybe other issues we don't understand. And I'll let you guys respond to the first one.
For the environment, if you can repair and reuse, that's a priority. I mean, it's better than to have to recycle and redo material, and that's very clear. Now, in terms of profits, I don't know I think that, I mean, apparently there is a market for it. And yeah.
More than $1,000 a month repairing, and they were like more like medium high income people.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I focused on in terms of where we saw opportunities for improving the process, as some of the challenges that I saw was like sort of across these. I think that there was a question earlier about when to do repair or not, and we saw a spectrum of this, right? So there were some people in Chile, and also in Thailand, that were just dedicated to repair. Right? And there were reasons why those people were dedicated to repair. I think some of it had to do with the training or experience that those people had, but also the location and what was available to them, right? So a lot of the other recyclers were people that didn't have access to things that were even repairable, right? So they were taking it down. So I think, you know, I think we should probably work on all of those problems, right? I'm not sure, and I think it depends on what country you're in or what sort of the context is in terms of the percentage of, you know, what is available for repair, what the secondary market exists for repair, and how big that is. What is the sort of premium you pay for a new piece of thing? I remember we had a bunch of conversations about that, and I think that does vary by country, right? So in the U.S., it's very, very rare for people to buy refurbished consumer electronics, right? So you have to make it a lot cheaper, so the profit is less, right? In other countries, that's not true. So all of those things, I think there has to be sort of an interdisciplinary effort to understand why, again, why is someone deciding to recycle it and dismantle it to this level? Because there's also different levels of dismantling, right? So I can take it down to copper, or I could take it down to like parts to sell to someone to repair, right? And so there's these different stopping points in the dismantling process. And I think the through line for me is sort of what is that decision tree that someone is going down to decide when to stop and where to stop. I've been approaching it from sort of a like, how fast can I do this and how much money can I get from it? But clearly there are a lot of other things going on, right? There's the health, there's social justice, there's environmental justice, you know, there's all these questions that each individual person that's doing this is making that decision. I think if we can better understand that decision from like a more holistic point of view, then we can try and look at, should we be pushing people to repair? I think there might also be a selection bias in terms of like the people with repairing making more money, being in terms of, are they in an area where it's able to get stuff to repair and they have more training, so now they're able to make more money, right? And so if we tried to push other people to repair, they may not reach that same level, right? So I don't know, and I think maybe they would, right? And I think from an environmental perspective, certainly we want people to repair, right? Like that's better. So that's why I was asking about sort of that system dynamic question. It's like if we push people to repair, does the price go down? Does the price go up? What can the market sort of bear in this particular context? If we could understand that, make some models of that, maybe we could then say, okay, we should push people to repair in this area, but not in this area. And that's a great question. I think that's like an open, for me as an engineer, I'm always trying to predict performance, and I would really like to predict sort of technology adoption, right? And say like, I make this design decision, then you're going to use my product more, right? Or you're going to use my tool more. And so that's the question for me, is how we can sort of think about that.
Just to build on the last couple of questions, so from my experience in working in the electronics industry, there's actually a lot of remanufacturing and refurbishment. And one of the biggest challenges that comes into play, and I'm interested in the take kind of from both the public health and the engineering side, is that in certain countries, including very big markets, you can't actually put something back out on the market that was legal at the time that you sold it, given the chemicals that are in it, but is not legal now. Which goes kind of counter to that argument that it is, which I think generally speaking, it would typically be better to extend the useful life of something as long as possible, because if you're not going to, it's still going to go somewhere. It still exists. But I'm just curious if there's been research or if you all have perspective on that balance, because it's actually a huge issue in terms of being able to keep that on the market and keep cycling through.
And you have the trade-off, I mean, how long do you keep a car, or how long, I mean, and I try to differentiate product which have, for example, the use phase, which is dominant, and like a fridge is dominated, in fact, by its use. So in fact, for the environment, if you can buy a better fridge and better insulated especially, you've better to get rid of your old fridge. And then recover the material because the use is really dominant. And many of these, I mean, the washing machine, the fan, the electricity consumption will be dominant. So if you can have a technology break and have a fan which is more efficient, in fact, for the environment, it's better in that case. And in the same in a sense, if you, during the use phase, you have release of material which could be toxic and are substantial, then you've better, in fact, to switch to a new technology in that case. So that's correct. And if you can do that with efficiency and so on, that's possible.
So this brings up a really interesting question for me that I'm just going to put out there. I think, so you just mentioned modular design, right? So a lot of people like modular design. We do modular design for a lot of things. I was talking in my talk really just focused on trying to support e-waste workers, right? And thinking about the e-waste dismantling project. That's why I spent so much time just saying, okay, we're just talking about dismantling, just focus on this one thing. I think that there's plenty of opportunity for improvement in looking at the producers, OEMs, right? So who is making these things, improving the design of that. But it's actually really, really hard. So when you think about design for disassembly or designing for modularity, you almost always have a performance cost or an increase in price, right? And so like your iPhone is really, really integrated, and that's why it's light enough and has enough battery life and everything works together, but it has to be like all glue. You can't take it apart, right? It's very, very hard to take apart. So then, you know, people like that because you're like, oh, I have this magic phone. It's all one piece. It looks like a single piece of aluminum and glass, and this is so great. And it works for a long time, and it's really clear, you know, all these magic things, right? But the cost you pay for that is really hard to take apart into component parts, right? It's very hard to disassemble. And that's true for almost everything. So it's very hard to make like a modular phone, a modular fan. Your car used to be something that you could like integrate stuff into. You know, you could take stuff out, put a new engine in, or do these things. It's very hard to do now, right? Like they're very integrated for other reasons, right? And so, you know, that I didn't touch on that in my talk from an engineering perspective. It's very hard to make that balance where you get both, you know, this is better for disassembly, like end of life, like designing for end of life. You have to have this balance. Why would someone buy this if it performs worse, right? So you might have a car that's very good at end of life or a phone that's very good at end of life, but if no one buys it, you don't get any of that benefit, right? So you're trying to find that sweet, what is that balance? And that's another area of research that I wasn't really touching on in what I was discussing, but I think is a very interesting question.
Oh, hi. Just have a few sort of clarifying questions. I just wondered, with the when your TV or your fridge is about to get disassembled and then the metal is extracted, is it one person who's touching that product for that whole time, or is it a series of people?
I'll give the simple answer, which is it depends. So I'm done there. No, I think it really does depend on the context. So, for example, in Chile, we typically saw people working as a one-person shop, in which case they're doing everything. Whereas in Thailand, we saw some of these collaboratives where you might have multiple people all handling a specific part of the process. And to what degree that is formalized or becomes a collaborative versus an individual, I think is partly a business issue, partly a cultural context. But I think you can find any...
Yeah. Just following on to that, do we have any economists here, or economists that have worked on the project?
We don't.
It just seems to me that a lot of I was trying to think from the manufacturing point of view, you clearly can just apply things that work at Ford in Detroit to these contexts. But to what degree can you abstract those principles and apply them here? I think a lot of it is, you know, why are these 5-man bands rather than a group of people working together where you could have some form of a moving production line or something? I think that could be useful in the future to try and understand that.
Absolutely. So I will say the challenge in putting together even a workshop like this, much less a larger project, is finding all of these disciplines, getting access to them, getting them together. So even to get the pretty broad range of disciplines we have here was a Herculean effort. But you're right, there are so many other disciplines that are not represented here, which would also have contributions to make. So for that, we need more time and more money. And if you have either, I'm interested.
Yeah, I'm not an economist. But, one more just clarifying question. In a lot of the pictures and the videos, there's just debris which seems to be flying everywhere. What's happening to all that debris? I mean, just
Sure,
about
so
having a sheet on the ground could be an easy
so
way.
I think that's the answer. So it depends on which country we're talking about and what level of formality. So you're seeing sort of the lowest level of formality in a lot of these videos and pictures, but there definitely were sort of middle, I mean, you saw the stakeholders. There were sort of like the low level, and that was getting sold on and getting sold on and sold on. And depending on where you were, there was different levels of, I'm not gonna use the word cleanliness, but different levels of debris on the ground or in the area, right? One of the things that we saw a lot of was having a sheet on the ground, and then breaking, like having that pile of stuff there and then creeping it. But there wasn't a lot of what I would call sort of environmental engineering controls, right? So there wasn't a lot of engineering controls for putting it in something or doing something. Mainly it was on the ground, either on a sheet or not, and then being swept up after it. That's what I saw and observed when we were there.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks for all these presentations. I learned a lot. It was very interesting. So I want to take a step back, or maybe it's a step down. I'm not sure what it is. My experience is with Agbagblashi, but I saw there were some similar things happening in Thailand as well as in Chile in some environments. And I guess and I think this is obviously going to be a very complicated socio-political discussion as well, but at the engineering level, to me, the huge breakpoint between doing great damage to your community and environment as well as to yourself as compared to what you get if you can do only dismantling of various sorts as the approach to extract copper, for example, is people setting everything on fire. I mean, and I'm interested in sort of views on how to address that directly. I mean, that's obviously a terrible idea for all kinds of reasons, but it's also the decision that's happening de facto in low and middle income countries all over the place. So I think if you could first get to how do we get past setting things on fire, which I realize is a really complex question, that's a very important stop measure. And so I'd be interested in people commenting on that.
We visited a workshop in Chile, in Santiago, where the workers were telling us that they had a pretty clear decision point. So if a wire was of a certain diameter, they would actually strip it by hand. And it was only the very small wires, which are just basically infeasible to take a knife and strip, that they would burn. So they were aware and trying to avoid burning to the extent possible, and they were making that decision. But they did acknowledge there's certain types of products where burning is literally the only way to do this in an informal setting. So I guess the other thing I would caution against, so I think your statement that burning is great pollutant is absolutely right, but you know, as I look around, there's just as much water pollution, for example, that is totally independent of burning. So I think we focus on burning at our peril, even though it is the most perhaps obvious point of generation for contaminants. But I think, you know, particularly for the informal economy, and I'd love to hear Jesse and Olivier's thought here, maybe there are mechanical means that could replace burning under at least some circumstances. And I think we talked about this. Do you guys have?
So I would say that I think that the real question for any of these decisions is about why did they, so they're making it for a reason, right? So the person is burning it for a reason, usually throughput for how much you get back, right? So if I burn it, it's really quick. I don't actually have to do that much. I just light it on fire, right? And I can sort of stand there and watch it. Like I'm not, you know, I could be doing something else while it's burning. And I can do a lot of it at fast. And he's correct. We were talking to people and they were like, well, we have this stripper that does like a mechanical stripper. I can do it with a knife for this gauge of wire. And it's worth my time because I get this much copper back. Whereas what's below this gauge, I get this much copper back. It's not really worth my time. I'm just going to light it on fire, right? And so there, from my perspective, and I was discussing this with someone over lunch, it's sort of like, well, you know, I could put together, and they have, I mean, you were talking about before, people have bought industrial level wire strippers and had them in places, right? And had varying levels of use, right? Where people still decided to burn instead of using that wire stripper, right? So then you're like, well, I have this mechanical way of doing it. The capital cost is no longer the barrier, right? So there's still something about the performance of that wire stripper, whether it's the capacity to do different gauges of wire, which was one thing that we heard, or the speed of it, or the what sort of experience or energy that is required for you to implement that. There's something about that decision that you're still saying, you know what, this burning is a better choice, right? And the other thing that I would say is that in terms of, you know, I think Shabita mentioned earlier about political and sort of social decisions, I think there's a big thing where the suitability, so as an engineer, we often say, well, it's just not the right product. I misunderstood you in some way. This is not the right product. And I think that's true here, right? But there's also all these other things that go into your decision. And, you know, there's lots of reasons, whether it's, you know, access to markets, access to labor. Maybe to run this industrial machine, you need workers, but your labor force is fluctuating all the time and the price of labor fluctuates all the time. There's all these other things that go into your decision that are not necessarily engineering features, but affect this decision that you're talking about, right? So I think we need to have this interdisciplinary team, and I agree with the comment about economists. I'm married to one, so I'm sort of biased. But you know, we need a lot of people to think about what is the reason that they're choosing this. And I also agree that the cost is not necessarily that burning is the worst, but we know that all these things are bad, right, in terms of health outcomes. But bad is again a value judgment, right? So I don't want to necessarily put something on that either, right? It's about, why did you make this decision? Can I give you a better alternative, right? I would also say that this extends to deciding where to work. Like, what's the outside option? You made this choice for a reason, right? So what are your outside options? It's better to you than your outside options right now, or you wouldn't be doing it, right? So what are those other outside options? Can we improve those outside options in some way such that you would switch on your own because this is a better option for you, right?
Since my perspective, when talk with the people in January, it's a topic very common. This topic is burn, cooper, or cut. But the people talk about this join the coop in a place, and we need money. We need quickly money. It's the possible. One possible is burn, because it's quickly and it's immediately, but the price is lowest. When you burn the cooper, the price is lowest you pay for it, and so it's for the situation specific. But the problem is when you use the element, the tools, don't use gloves. And this is, for me, it's nurse is more important because, okay, don't burn. But when cut the for cut, don't use glove, and finally it cuts a lot. And blood, and have a lot of problems in the head. So yes, burn is not the good, but if you could, but don't use all the self-care measures is not the best too, because you need the people. It's because always the end is the quickly. It's fast. It's the money. So it's for now. And it's you put the glove, and it's a person, the old person in one part told is have a technique, putting the two pillars. And this is more quickly, but you have to use some specific tools, and you have to pay, and it's slow. It's so slow, but you cut, and it's no problem. But the other say, no, this is it's a lot of time, I don't have time, I need money today, I know tomorrow, and the other day. And this is a principal problem, that the issue you have to obtain an informal workers. You have to obtain the good cooper, a good quality and a high price is slow the process, and the people need the money in this moment.
Let me just make a comment here too. There's one critical group of people missing from this panel and this entire workshop, which is the actual recyclers. So we had several of them scheduled to come, and for various legal and other reasons, none of them were able to attend. I mean, this is not a privileged fraction of the population in any of these three countries. So what we do have access to, though they're not here, are these people in the three countries. And so anything that we come up with in this room is purely academic. We need to talk to these folks and get their input. Would you view this favorably? Would this be possible? Could we try this as an experiment and compare and see if this method is better than burning? So I do just want to make that particular comment. The inclusivity discussion that Kristen led us through earlier is absolutely right. We can't make any determinations or even any judgments on what people are doing without having their representation. We're doing our best to get that, but again, none of those folks are here today.
Perhaps also one challenge is how we can better combine the informal and formal economy, but without replacing the informal by the formal. I mean, I remember we had discussion in preparing the first trip. People suggested that in fact, we would buy that. The question is, if you start buying in the formal economy, the income will still come to the same people, or which is probably a challenge there. And to think what mechanism we could have that the money still go to the desired people in some respect, and without moving that out of their hands.
Great comment. Another question, yeah, please.
For your presentations, this is very interesting and helpful to me. I want to ask, how did you push your researchers a step forward, which really affect management and policy? Because I think frequently we say the studies are already enough and we have enough knowledge, and we don't want to say this is another researchers come and go case. Thank you.
So I invite all of us to chime in, but I'll say I think the key thing that we're doing that I think I don't claim that we're inventing this or that it hasn't been done before, but I think we need more of it, is bringing together our various disciplines. So I've been publishing in the public health literature. Jesse's been publishing in the engineering literature. We may be publishing on related topics, but we haven't been talking to each other, which means we're siloed, which means we're weak. We are much stronger together. So I think as we start to have these interdisciplinary teams where we can say, gosh, what would the policy ramifications be if there was this engineering alteration, a new development, new technology, if we developed a public health intervention, and how might these things work together and build one on the next? I think as we can come up with more comprehensive solutions that really address multiple facets and not just the health issue. Also, to come back to Dan's comment, the more we can pull in some economic data to say not only are we saving lives, but we're actually saving money. At least in America, that makes a big difference. So I think working in teams here is going to actually let us get further than if we were all working independently. Even if we're doing the same research, we're sharing our results and we're developing, oh God, corporate buzzword, synergies, that will enable us again to be stronger than we would as individuals. So that's kind of my high level response, but I'd encourage everyone else to chime in. Or not.
Yeah. So I think it's a great question. I think that there's different avenues for having impact, right? So I think that's your question, right? Like, how does research, is this just an academic project? Maybe we learn some new scientific knowledge, but that's sort of where it ends, right? And what is the impact on the communities at the end of the day? I think that in particular, if you look at economics, so like development economics, right? Certainly has had a large impact because the major players in these fields are now listening to that research, right? So I would say something like doing randomized controlled trials for microcredit, which started as a research project, some time ago. Now, like Gates and all the foundations have changed it. Now, is that necessarily for good? I don't know. I don't want to make a claim about that, right? But I think that the real challenge here is that we think that there are these unanswered questions to sort of guide these policymakers. Now, so I'm using the word policymakers, but people that are making decisions that have impact. So funders, USAID, if they're doing a project, we're trying to, at least for me, the goal is to try and produce some knowledge that can help guide those decisions. Now that means that we need to talk to those people and publish in places where those people read, or actually be working with those people. So that's what I'm trying to do, is to try and reach out to those people and be working with those people, mainly because I need money for my research work, right? But because I'm an assistant professor. But at the end of the day, I think working with the government, the really interesting thing that drew me to this project was the involvement of the local governments, especially in the Thailand case and in the Chile case, like all these cases where we had people, academics in the country, but also people that were working in those local government and sort of decision maker positions, right? So the question I think you're asking, which is one that we should be trying to answer the best we can, but everyone in this room should be trying to answer, is like, who is the decision maker in this case? Who are the stakeholders? Who is actually making a decision that has an impact on the ground? And are we working with them to make sure that we're answering the questions they want answered, right? And I don't know if that's true or not. I'm trying to make that true for myself, but obviously I'm just one part of it.
So I think we've got time for one more question, and then we're going to take our break. And I'm not sure.
Sure.
You first? Okay.
So let me just try to give you a perspective on a recycler. I'm affiliated with a recycler. It's a secondary refiner. So the question was asked, why do they burn? The reason they burn is because of the purity. I just happen to have in my car samples of red metal fraction. So when we go through the whole e-waste process, ultimately what the smelter want to receive is clean, pure red metal fraction. You get a better price. So the return on investment is much greater. So if you send me wire, I'm going to charge you a cost to burn that wire plastic off before you can get a clean copper. So I think that would be the purpose behind the reason they burn. And I know as a Canadian recycler, I mean, we recycle in excess of about 300 million pounds a year. And what we send to the smelter is clean red fraction metal.
Great. Thank you for that insight. So I think the direction of the conversation here is going to set us up perfectly for our post-break session. So we're going to take a half-hour break right now, and then we're going to come back and talk about policies and management and the business perspective. So I'd invite you all to head downstairs to the Earl Lewis room on the 3rd floor for coffee. I think the speakers are more than happy to continue the discussion, and I'd love to give our panelists a round of applause here. Thank you. So yes, we'll reconvene in 30 minutes. Thank you all.